Good morning and welcome back to I'll Knit If I Want To. My name is Andrea Mowry of Drea Renee Knits, and this is a little weekly Friday, I guess it's called a vlog, where I try to answer your questions that you send in. If you have a question you would like me to try to answer, then you can look right below this video where it says show description and click show more. And at the bottom of all that information, you're gonna see a link to ask your question. So just go ahead and click that. All other links that I might mention during the episode will also be below. Today I am wearing my LYS Little Yellow Sweater cardigan, and I'm wearing it with a new top I've sewn. This is the Peplum top. It has a cute little V in the back from Peppermint Magazine. It's a free pattern, and I'm super stoked with how it turned out. I already want to make another one. So let's get on to the questions. Question number one, I'm very interested to learn how you organize your daily schedule to make time for all you do. Do you have extra help at home for your household stuff and childcare? I'm struggling daily to make time to knit and hence sleep and do much needed exercise while producing FOs. Your input is greatly appreciated. So I definitely feel for you. There's just never enough hours in the day to do all I want to do. So from the beginning when I started this, and even before when I started my business when my daughter was about 8 months old, so even leading up to that, I just tried to set myself up so that I can make the little pockets of minutes add up. So I like to have projects going that are pretty mindless and that can easily be set down. I think that if you have to kind of really dig to find where you are in your pattern or your project, that can end up taking some precious minutes that you might not have. And then if you also are doing a really complicated project that is not easy to set down and all of a sudden your kiddo needs you or whatever it may be, that can be challenging too when you're like, oh, I gotta get to like this last stitch in the row. So I think always having a small, easy to carry project's really great. I recommend my DRK Everyday Socks. I almost always have a pair of those on the go. It's really easy to pick those up, put them in a small little bag. I sometimes would always carry a little project bag that I could wear with me. So if my kids started playing, I could take that few minutes. I work full time and my husband is a stay-at-home father. So I definitely still have lots of family responsibilities, but I do have his help. So that's how I get a lot of my work done, my work knitting and all of that. But sewing, spinning, exercising, all of those other hobbies, I still try to fit in time for. I'm also the main person that cooks in our family. So again, I think it's just taking advantage of those little pockets of time. When it comes to sewing, I like to kind of batch prep stuff. So I might trace a couple patterns in my size, cut them out, or just cut out. I like to use Swedish tracing paper, so I'll cut out that part. And then when I have a few more minutes, I'll cut out the fabric. And then I just leave it all stacked and folded by project. So that way, when I have a few minutes for the next thing I can do, I hop to it. I try to get in a little bit of time after my kids go to bed, but I am a pretty early to bed person. I go to bed at like 9 every night. So sometimes that's only an hour or two. And then I'm an early riser, so I like to get up around 5:30. So I'm always racing to try and get up before my kids so I can have coffee and some quiet time and work on some non-work projects. That doesn't always happen. My son, I swear he has a radar for when I get up, and he likes to immediately try to find me. But even with that, with kids, depending on your kid's age, I try to set him up with like quiet activities for the morning when he does get up with me and just kind of communicate to him like, this is quiet time. But yeah, I think just realizing that, like, not trying to fight for big blocks of time and instead just taking advantage of the little ones by setting yourself up. So just kind of breaking everything into bite-sized pieces for when you can sneak some stuff in. And it's really amazing how those really add up. Like, I remember reading Elizabeth Zimmerman's book. Which one was it? I can't remember which one it was. It might have been Knitting Around, where she talks about knitting on socks when you are riding the bus and how if you have like this long of a bus ride and you knit every time, how many pairs of socks that could end up being in a year? You know, it can really add up. So, all right, next question. So I actually found 3, and there was probably more, but lots of you were wondering about pilling. So how do you prevent or remove pilling on a finished object? Does superwash pill more than non-superwash? How do I get rid of the pilling? I've been using small scissors. That would scare me. I don't think I would use scissors. Just be very, very careful if you are. And again, my favorite method for depilling and any yarns that are less likely to pill. So the first thing that's going to cause pilling is basically a short staple length. So what that means is the length of the fiber of that yarn. So think of a sheep and how long their hair is. And so the shorter that is, the higher chance of it pilling, the more likelihood of it pilling. So cashmere will always be the pilliest of the pilly, where long wools are going to have less of a chance of pilling because they're just not so short. Another way to think about it is usually the softer the yarn, the more it pills. So you just kind of have to accept that some yarns are going to pill. A lot of times working with a yarn is going to tell you when that happens. There's a yarn that I really used a lot. It is made at a Michigan mill. It's called Shepherd's Wool, and it's milled at Stonehenge Fiber Mill in Michigan. It's really lovely, pretty affordable yarn. I loved that it was Michigan milled. It's very pilly, and that didn't deter me. It was just, you have to know that that is how that is going to act. So my favorite way to depill is using a gleaner, and this is a depilling tool where you basically just scrape down your sweater. So I don't have too many. You can see a couple little pills. So I would set this out on a table, and you just, oh, sorry, it's not the most pleasant sound for you all to listen to, but you just scrape down and it'll snag all those little pills. That's been my favorite tool that I've tried. I've never had, it can also get fuzz, like the sun's really good for getting fuzz off. And I've never had any problems with it. It won't damage your woolens, and it's pretty quick. I kind of think of depilling as kind of like blocking, where you do want to give yourself a little bit amount of time, because depending on how pilly your sweater is, it may take a little bit longer. But yeah, that's how I do it. And just to recap, the softer the yarn, short staple lengths, those are gonna pill more than a woolier wool yarn. So the person who asked, is it superwash versus non-superwash? Not really. It really depends what that yarn, what kind of fiber that yarn was made of. So, but a lot of those superwash yarns are quite soft. Some of them have cashmere in them, and so they can be pilly. But I've actually found that the 2 pilliest yarns I've used were non-superwash, but they were definitely those kind of really soft drapey yarns. All right, question number 3. So I wanted to answer this one too, because I get this one a lot in my inbox. A lot of people will ask, how do you adjust a pattern to use a different weight of yarn? So I'll have people email a lot saying, oh, I want to knit this pattern, but I want to use this yarn for it. And the long and short of it is, that is probably the most complicated modification you could do, because you basically have to rewrite the pattern. So unfortunately, probably not the answer many people want to hear, but changing the gauge completely changes the whole pattern, because you have to change all your stitch counts. I definitely see knitters do it. It just has to be something you're comfortable with, and you have to know you're going to be doing a lot of math, because you're changing all of the numbers of the pattern. So you would have to find your stitch and row gauge, compare it to your schematic and the instructions, and basically recalculate all the math for that problem. So that is why you'll see designers, if they put out a different weight, like have a pattern that comes in 2 different weights, a lot of times they charge separately for those, because it takes just as much work to rewrite that pattern. And that's also why generally a designer is not going to be able to give you instructions for the gauge you would like to knit it at if it doesn't match the gauge of the pattern, because it would really be them writing a new pattern for you. That doesn't mean you can't try it. I have, before I was a designer, there was a yarn I just really wanted to use from my stash for a project that I'd been wanting to make. And so and it was kind of like a fun, I'm just gonna try this and see what happens. Kind of challenge myself, experiment. But yeah, it's basically kind of rewriting that pattern. Sorry, I have a little, something just flew in my eye. So yeah, that is kind of what it comes down to. I recommend always sticking with the yarn weight called for in a pattern. Unless you can get gauged with a different weight, then you just have to think, okay, is it drastically changing the drape of the fabric? So you might be able to use, let's say it's a DK weight, and you're able to get gauge using a fingering weight on really big needles. That's just gonna cause a much more open drapey fabric. So you kind of have to weigh, is this what I want, or do I want it to be what the designer intended? All right, let's keep going. Question 4. Which of your patterns would you suggest for someone who has never knitted a sweater before but wants to try? So this is a question I get all the time too. And I am always hesitant to, I don't generally put a, oh my goodness, what's the word? Advanced, medium, beginner, skill level. There it is. I really prefer not to label my patterns that way because I just think it can be really misleading. We are all different. We all think differently. Some of us understand things differently than others. You know, some people think cables, they could do them in their sleep. Other people feel that way about brioche. Some people will never feel like they could do brioche. So I think that only we can determine what we feel is easy, intermediate, or challenging. So what I do instead is I put on all of my patterns, if you look at the pattern pages on either Ravelry or my website, DreaReneeKnits.com, at the bottom of all that info, I do techniques to indulge in, and I list all of the major techniques that are used in that pattern. So you can see, do I know how to do all these techniques, or am I excited and willing to learn any of the techniques that I might not yet know? And I do try to provide lots of tutorials for anything I think might be a little more challenging or is just easier to learn with a visual if somebody hasn't done it before, and include those video tutorials linked in my patterns. Or you can also check out, you're on my YouTube channel now, so you can check out my tutorials. But that being said, as far as beginner goes, I do always kind of check out. Sometimes I see somebody ask that somewhere, and then a bunch of other people will hop in and leave what they maybe did out of my patterns that they felt was a pretty easy first time sweater. So if you are a knitter watching this right now and you're like, oh, I knit this as my first sweater, it was great, please feel free to drop that down below because I think that's great to share. But the Weekender comes up a lot. It's my most popular pattern. It is not a ton of shaping. It's basically, you know, a rectangle with 2 rectangle sleeves. So there's a little bit of short rows in there. The trickiest part's really the cast on and bind off, and you could always swap in one you feel more comfortable with. I believe I even give a recommendation for that in the pattern. And it tends to be a great fit. I've seen all different body shapes and sizes, really happy with the outcome. So I think that is a great beginner one. So faded, you could even choose to do one color instead of faded, and that comes in both adult and child sizes and is just a basic raglan with cute little garter stitch detail on the sleeves. So I think those would be the 2 I would recommend to start with. I also am gonna have a couple really great wardrobe staples coming out this fall and winter, excuse me. So keep an eye out for those, and especially one of them I think is gonna be a great beginner sweater. So I'll share some sneaks of that as we get closer to the release date. It's in testing right now. All right, let's keep going. Question number 5, do you pre-wash your indie yarns before knitting with them? No, I don't. you know, they're washed after they're dyed. I'm guessing this question comes from a fear of the yarn bleeding. I've only ever experienced that once, and my tip for that would be if you are nervous, and I could be totally wrong, that might not be why that person is asking that question, but that's where my mind goes to. So if you're worried about bleeding, I would snip off a little bit of the yarns you're planning on using together and put them in a bowl of hot water and see if your saturated color bleeds into the lighter color that you're planning on using. And if not, then you're good to go. And if they do bleed into each other, I would probably pick a different yarn combo and use that saturated yarn all by itself. But I've only had that issue happen once, and it was on a completed sweater, and I was like, oh no. It actually happened this year, so I've gone many years with no color bleeding. And some indie dyers I've noticed will even say on their colors that might be prone to bleeding, like, you know, reds have a higher chance of bleeding. Sometimes they'll kind of warn on those ones and say, hey, don't use this with a white yarn. But you could always ask the indie dyer you're purchasing from too. And a lot of times they have great tips on what to do if you're concerned about that. There's things you can do like putting color catchers or vinegar. Blocking in cold water really helps, because what that does is it closes down the cuticle of all the yarn. So of your saturated color yarn, it'll close down that cuticle so it's harder for the color to escape. And then it's also closed the cuticle of your light color yarn so it's harder for color to get in. So I would definitely recommend keeping that in mind. All right, I have a little bonus question here. Do you have any particular tips for brioche? So yes, my number one is to just slow down. I find that when I am teaching brioche, what I see happening and what I felt myself was that our hands and brain stop wanting to chat to each other, and you just kind of want to get your groove back. Especially, this is very much mostly for knitters who've been knitting for a long time. Usually the longer you've been knitting, the more of this tendency there is that we just want to get like right back into our knitting rhythm. And that's when all of a sudden we start just like blowing through a row and we're like, oh my gosh, I forgot to do my yarn overs. I just knit all the stitches, or whatever it may be. Like that tends to be what kind of trips this up. So just remember, your hands are being manipulated in a different way than they usually are, because when you're working brioche, you're working one stitch, but then you slip the next stitch and wrap a little yarn over around it. And so it's breaking up our natural rhythm every other stitch. So that's just something to keep in mind. That slowing down is really going to help. I also say this is in the beginning or maybe forever. Brioche is definitely like your morning coffee knitting, not girls' night out, knit night, maybe with alcohol involved knitting, you know. But don't mix brioche and wine because that tends to be when mistakes can happen for people. So high focus time is great. And also just remembering, if you already know how to knit, purl, slip a stitch, and do a yarn over, then you already have all the tools you need to do brioche. It's just a combination of those things. So kind of simplifying it that way in your head so it doesn't feel kind of as nerve-wracking. And I also highly recommend starting with 2-color brioche over 1-color brioche, because then you're going to be able to see the anatomy of those stitches a lot more clearly with those contrasting colors, to kind of start to learn what's going on, which is going to start to give you confidence to work your brioche, to fix mistakes and all of that. So yeah, those would be my top tips. All right, that is it for this week. On Tuesday, I'm releasing my Rhinebeck sweater. So if you are not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe to my newsletter. There is a link below because there's going to be a pretty awesome discount in that newsletter, and you'll be the first to know when the pattern is live on both knittalong.com and in my Ravelry shop. I'm super excited. There is going to be a knit along, and we are going to do a meetup for anyone coming to New York Sheep and Wool Festival in Rhinebeck, New York in October. And I think we're even going to do a virtual one for anyone who is not able to make it or still just isn't ready to be around people yet. So we're super excited. We've got some really fun stuff planned. So I hope you'll join us for that. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. I hope you have a great weekend. Happy knitting.